Living in St David's, if you need company, you can go down the pub, someone will shout you a pint. If you're in trouble, someone will turn up and lend you a hand.
Well, it's a very close-knit community. Everybody seems very happy and we all know one another.
Well, it's obviously the cathedral. That is the main attraction of the city of St David's.
To see the cathedral, that must be the only thing here that really stands out 100% above everything else. Seeing it wet and seeing it dry, two different characters altogether. It's beautiful.
If St David's was an animal, I think it would be a tortoise, because everything's pretty slow in Pembrokeshire.
St David's was an animal, crouching tiger, hidden Welsh dragon.
Mark Steele's in town.
Thanks very much and welcome to Mark Steele's in Town, which this week comes from the City Hall in the bustling 24-hour non-stop city that never sleeps, St David's in West Wales, the city that many believe was originally used to film Mean Streets, as New York wasn't dangerous enough. It's the City Halls because St David's is a city, the smallest one in Britain, because anywhere with a cathedral is a city, even if, in your case, that's all you've got. I just imagine how disappointed some teenager from Haverfordwest would be if they said to their parents, "I'm sick of this small town. I'm going off to the bright lights. I'm going to the city." And then came here. And ended up with people going, "Oh, you're from Haverfordwest, are you? Well, you won't find it so easy here to get your fancy urban products. Like crisps and a banana." It is tiny here, but being a city must make you feel bigger than you are, I would imagine, St David's. For example, you've got a one-way system, and you're really not big enough to justify a one-way system. The town planners must have thought, there we are, now the buggers have got to see all of us, see? Not just look at the cathedral, they'll have to look at the Matthias hardware store as well. And this is right on the far end of Wales here, less than 50 miles from Ireland. It makes you realise that Wales tricks you as a country. It pretends to be small, but if you're coming from, say, London, then you get to the Severn Bridge and think, we're in Wales, we're almost there. People look out for St David's, it must be round the corner. And then 2 days later, you think, how much further? What's this place? Carmarthen? There can't be anywhere further than this. And then your radio starts picking up Irish Gaelic stations. You think, have I driven through the Irish Sea without realising? And when you finally get here, it turns out that Wales is actually bigger than Russia. Because this is a city that now revolves around tourism. So when someone asks what time the shops shut here, the honest answer is August. Seems strange, I would grant you that. It must seem strange that for 3 months this place is packed with millions of people swimming and surfing, and then suddenly it goes back to being empty. Now, I was here in November and I made the mistake of trying to get something to eat at 10 to 9. I thought, I'll be fine, I've seen that there is a chip shop. But when I asked people in the pub I was in if the chip shop was all right, they said, well, it is if you can wait until June. The police station here is only open in the summer. And there's a notice on the door that says, I quote, "In case of emergency, ring the helpline." So if a robbery happens in September, how bad must the getaway driver be to get caught? The car won't start. Don't worry, I'll phone the garage. They'll have the parts in 2 months. We'll have a 6-month start on the cops. I went in the bookshop, which is a charmingly tiny shop and run by Chris. And as soon as I went in, he said to me, "Hello, you're only the 3rd person who's been in all day. I might as well not have opened." But it's this sort of moment that makes you realise it's not quite Oxford Street, is it? If you run a shop here, I suppose it's worth knocking on every door in the city before you open in the morning and asking, are you likely to pop in? And if only 3 say yes, lock up and have a couple of weeks in Milford Haven. And everybody knows everyone. Every time I've mentioned someone that I've met to someone else, the person I'm talking to has gone, oh yes, them. So I say, all right, do you know them? And they go, yes, I was married to them 7 years. After that, I think it's fair to say that there is a mix, a genuine mix here of being welcoming and not so welcoming to outsiders. I was in the Farmer's Arms, which I'm sure many of you know. Someone was trying to get someone to come over and chat to me. And they said, oh, that person's dad will be a really good person. He's been a fisherman here for many, many years. And then half an hour later, the man he'd spoken to try and get his dad to come over, came over. And I swear this was his exact words. He said, I've got a message from my dad. He says, if that chap from the radio is still there, tell him I can't be asked to talk to him. But it keeps you on your toes, this sparkling mix of dour on the one hand and overwhelmingly friendly on the other. You never quite know where it's coming from. It's a brilliant mix. Hello, you're very welcome. Can I buy you a drink? No, buy your own. Lovely to have you here. Can't stand your sort. Coming in, we're closed. Even the books for tourists can be magnificently dour. I got one, Across the Sounds it's called, and its advice for getting to Ramsey Island goes like this. The target is St David's, reached by taking the A487 from Haverfordwest or Fishguard. If you want to start from anywhere else, that's your own affair. That's the tourist pamphlet. I expected it to carry on local attractions. You'd better like cathedrals or you've wasted your petrol. St David clearly did live round here. I don't think there's any dispute about that. He lived in the 6th century, apparently, shortly after St Patrick, and he set up a monastery and several churches when it would still have been a bit pagan round here, and Celtic, because my history book says that no fact has been produced to prove that the Romans got this far or any further than Carmarthen, which must make you very proud, I would have thought, that the Romans made it all the way from Rome to Carmarthen but couldn't do the last few miles. Because they were probably walking down the A487 and then one bloke was sent out to say, tell that emperor if he's still there we can't be asked to come and talk. But because the Romans never got here, this was why the Welsh language was preserved, as well as other examples of Welshness. And the book I was reading said they had a common language there and remained a quarrelsome and independent people. Hard to believe, isn't it? The book about St David's, written by a local, St David's and Jewisland that I have there, it has a poem written in the 1920s. You might expect this to boast about the tranquility and the holiness or something, which it does in a way. This is the first verse. It goes, here holy David's church, that far from all resort, with contemplation seemed most fitly to comport. It's void of all delight, cold, barren, bleak and dry. No pleasure might allure, nor steal the wandering eye. That should bring in the visitors by the coach road. Who writes your poems here, Morrissey? So how often do people go in the cathedral? Do you all go visit it a lot? Yeah. It's a classy cathedral, there's no doubt that. It's built in a valley, which is unusual. It was built in a valley so the Vikings couldn't see it from the sea, as then they would know that someone was here. And the cathedral slopes, the floor slopes, not just a bit, but a long way, which is exciting, you know. I think in the winter you could use it for skiing lessons, the cathedral. And I was told that the reason that there's a clock on every tower, except the one facing north, is that the people in that direction were asked to pay for one, and they wouldn't cough up. Now, that sounds unlikely as it is, and then you look out north from the cathedral, and then there's just one house north, and about 50 miles of hills. Empty hills. This poor bloke in that house couldn't afford it on his own, could he? suppose if he wanted to know the time, he must have just walked miles until he could see the east clock and go 10 to 4 and go home again. As well as the cathedral, you've also got a bishop's palace, of course, which is right next door, that has no roof because the lead was stolen. So I asked the guide, I said, was that Cromwell who stole the lead then? Was it modern thieves? I hope it wasn't modern thieves. And the guide said, no, we think the bishop stole it himself. Now that is class, St David's. That's cool. Some bishop in the 18th century down the scrap metal yard. They've got a roof for you. How much? Best get rid of it before me, because that's when the police station opens. There's an unusual side to the religion of St David's, I've found, which is that throughout history there's been the cathedral on the one hand and then all these dissenting churches built in opposition to the cathedral on the other. Baptists and Congregationalists, Presbyterians, but the nonconformist church was mostly built around Methodism, in which preachers set up chapels in their own houses. And the Methodist revival at the end of the 18th century had a huge effect on this area. It was the religion of labourers that preached that we do God's work by helping the poor. But also, Methodism, of course, was fiercely anti-alcohol. Methodism has had a slightly tricky press in recent times because of the bank executive, who was a Methodist preacher, but turned out to be taking crack, which is a dreadful shame, as he's brought the otherwise good name of banking executives into disrepute. Back before then, Methodism converted around half the population here, and this seemed to fit the history of St David's from the earliest days onwards, as it seemed to swing between these two ideas. On the one hand, strict religion and temperance, and on the other, extreme drunkenness. For example, there's a description of life from my T. Thewi pamphlet that talks of the rigour of work, ploughing without oxen, strictness and discipline. But then it goes on, but on a lighter note were the efforts to get rid of new neighbours by sending down handmaidens to do a striptease and use lewd gestures to destabilise the monks. I reckon this is what Miley Cyrus is doing. She's destabilising monks. In 1899, despite all this Methodism, there were more pubs per population in Pembrokeshire than in any other county. This is the sort of thing that went on. According to a magazine there, Pembrokeshire Life, which I would recommend. Just by Haverfordwest in Prendergast, there was an annual event of electing a mayor, and according to this magazine, the worthiest citizen was he who was most hopelessly drunk on the day of the election. And once chosen, this was part of the rules, honestly. It was customary for the mayor to make an acceptance speech, if not too far gone. However, in 1859, Mr. Evans was incapable of speaking and could only nod. And alongside this are the Methodist preachers, who one account of the local school says were intense and devoid of humour. And there was a man called George Pocock, a field Methodist who ran a grammar school in St David's, who, I quote, invented and patented a self-acting ferule, a machine for beating recalcitrant boys. I have to say, St David's, I'm really slightly uneasy at the fact you're just looking at me like that's normal. He invented a machine for beating boys. You're not meant to industrialise boy beating. Did it have settings, this thing? Mild rebuke, leave a mark and 50 Shades of Grey, did it? Did Amnesty International and Save the Children know that this sort of thing was going on? Wasn't there a Live Aid concert someone could do? Please, please help these poor, poor children. And then a song, there's a place in Wales where children still get beaten, where in winter time not a single chip gets eaten. Help them now before the mayor wakes up. On the other hand, My social history of the city tells me that in the 19th century, early marriage, large families and promiscuity were laid at the door of religious enthusiasm, the extra opportunity for sexual fraternisation that followed the introduction of the evening service. What a place this is! That can't hear the words, "We're holding an extra service for worship," and interpret that as, "Whoa!" When I read this, I'm afraid it did make sense. I'm on very dodgy ground here, but I can only tell the truth, St David's. I spoke to a taxi driver. The taxi driver showed me the cathedral and the high street and the tourist centre and told me some of the history. And then just as I was getting out the car, said the words, "Oh, one other thing. This is a big centre for wife swapping." I can't say if there's any truth to this, as there are limits to the amount of research I'm prepared to do. But later on I did meet my informant again, and I swear this is what they said. I often pick people up early in the morning who are going back home after a swap. And one morning I picked someone up and said, "I haven't seen you for a few weeks," and the person replied, "Well, no, that's because my grandkids found out what I was doing, so I thought I'd best give it a rest for a month." And not only that, my chlamydia's been playing me up rotten. Now, I've got to be honest with you, St David's. I've been doing this series for 5 years, and that is the most magnificent thing I've heard. I can only stand in awe at how such a small community can create prose as glorious as that. But the most obvious aspect of St David's, even more than the cathedral or any local hobbies, is the sea. The Irish Sea isn't just out at sea, it's on the land. The walls in the pub are covered in photos of lifeboats and trawlers. Even in winter there's a surfing shop, and I don't think I've met anyone yet who has got some connection with the lifeboat, so I presume you just all take turns to rescue each other. I went to the lifeboat station, and it's a magnificent, majestic-looking vehicle, your lifeboat, with a huge chart on the wall next to it of all the times it's been called out. For example, it says, 23rd of July, windsurfer reported to be in difficulties. Windsurfer reported, when we got hold of him, that he was fine and windsurfing. Lifeboats returned to station. Now, the lifeboat people are obviously very heroic, I'm not going to argue with that, but they're people we should all admire, not just for their bravery, but for their attention to detail. To give you just one example, last year they built a new lifeboat here, a magnificent vessel, and it's only a few feet bigger than the boat shed it was supposed to fit in. Now, I found a typical story that makes you realise how safe we are in the hands of lifeboat volunteers. This is from the book A Squint at St David's. There was a lifeboat man called William in the Farmer's Arms, and the book says, age had caught up with him. He was over 70 but looked fit as a fiddle, and he couldn't understand why he'd been asked to retire from the lifeboats. There's absolutely nothing wrong with me, he protested. I can still drink 12 pints a day. Now, part of the attraction of the boats is Ramsey Island, but in particular the wildlife that's out there, especially the seals. So the tour companies promise to educate anyone who goes on a boat round Ramsey. For example, the Ramsey tour guide boasts, "We have even seen pink flamingos migrating overhead. To this day, we have no idea why." Now, there's huge potential in that, St David's. Tours led by people who have no idea. There's a bird of some sort over there. I expect it's got a name. I don't know what it is, mind. At some point, it'll probably go somewhere else. It must eat something, maybe apple crumble, for all I know. Now, there are usually 100 seals living on the island, and the company that arranges the tour said on its website, generally the females live 5 to 10 years longer than the males. This is probably to do with the fact that during the breeding season they breed on a harem basis, whereby an adult bull will hold a territory with as many as 8 breeding females. Unless his chlamydia's playing up, obviously. So I'm going to introduce Tim now. And Tim, you lived for a while on Ramsey Island.
Yeah, I did, and I absolutely loved it.
So you actually lived there. So at night you were there?
At night I was there on my own, in the dark. It was quite scary, but I don't know why.
And you must have had quite a few tourists come up and ask you questions in the daytime then?
We had some lovely people. There was a woman who was very, very concerned about the wildlife, and she asked me, the seals are lovely, but who feeds them in the winter?
Was she American?
No, she was English.
And I apologise on behalf of us all. And was the one you were telling me about Solva Bay?
Oh, the lady who was worried about how they ruined Solva. Now, it used to be so pretty when the tide was in and the harbour was full, but now it was really ruined because they'd taken all the water out of the harbour.
Thanks very much, Tim. Another intriguing side to being a small city by the sea is how it affects your rivalry with towns nearby. For example, in 2006 there were rumours that St David's might be asked to merge its council with Fishguard. Now, as somebody wrote on the community website, St David's merge with Fishguard? Are you soft in the head? St David's is the smallest and most elegant city in Britain. Why would we merge with that rat-infested dump? There's more chance of Tony Blair moving his family to Moncton. But this now is a new, softer St David's, because you've become a centre for art. No less. There's pottery everywhere and sculpture. One of the buildings open in winter is an art gallery. It's only just occurring to me that Shut Chip Shop is probably an art installation. There are glass artists and there are studios. And in particular, I'd like to introduce at this point Graham, who is an artist who is conducting the most magnificent project as far as I can see. First of all, Graham, a lot of arty people say, oh, it's the light in a place like St David's. So is that true? There is a different...
Yeah, it is. The westerly light, which is quite dramatic. You know, you get the reflections of the sea, all that kind of, and the sun goes down in the west. So it's all quite laid back. And a bit like the sort of California of West Wales, really.
Yes, it is in many, many ways. But now, in particular, this is not the city, as in the buildings, but every person in St David's, the entire population.
That's what my ambition is. It's people involved with St David's. It's not just the people on the electoral roll. It's people involved with the community. Well, it is. Yeah. No, it's people who are involved with the community and people who embrace the community. And it's about the community spirit. Not being too serious or anything, but
no, I've seen you've done 200 so far, and it looks brilliant.
Yes, almost. So, which is about a 10th, which is a bit of a milestone.
So now, if someone else moves in, do you think, oh, you bastard?
Well, I was one of those people. I didn't say that to myself, but yeah, there's another person to paint. I know what you mean.
And everyone's up for it. You've not met anyone yet who's
I haven't had a negative response so far. So
I think it's absolutely brilliant. A round of applause for Graham.
Thank
you. And also, I hate to break this to you, Graham, but there is actually a bloke in Moncton who's already painted the whole population of his town. He's a courtroom artist. The main industry, of course, here now is tourism, and there's so much of it that in the summer the population goes from 1,600 to 20,000. So I'd like to introduce someone now who's been very helpful every time I've seen her, who works at the tourist office, Kerry, who I'm sure many of you know. Kerry, this must be an odd thing then when it goes to being hugely mega busy and then suddenly empty again.
Well, the thing I remember is I worked in an ice cream shop couple of years back, and 31st of August, non-stop, all-day ice cream. There was a queue out the door. Next day, no one came in.
Not a single person?
Not a single person, pretty much all day.
There was 3 going to come in, but they went to the bookshop.
I know.
There's no one. And there must be times. It's very beautiful, your tourist office. It's not a normal tourist office. It's all lovely and curvy, and there's an art gallery and that in there. There must be times. Have you ever had like a really stupid tourist, like the ones that spoke to Tim?
I had someone come in once saying, "Is this the St David's I've heard about?" And I was like, "Well, probably. We're quite famous, smallest city in Britain, etc." It's like, "But we were told it was undercover." And I was like, "Well, what do you mean, And they said, "Oh, we were told it was big, lots of shops undercover." I was like, "Do you mean the shopping centre in Cardiff, Too far."
So the St David's shopping centre in Cardiff? Oh, that's magnificent. And what did you say? Yes, it is undercover.
Well, I just suggested all the places that are undercover, I was like, well, because it was raining at the time,
You didn't send them to a taxi driver to find out?
No.
Thanks very much, Kerry. Thank you. I'm not sure if you would agree with this, Kerry. I think that I've not been here in the summer when it's been all chaotic, as you've been saying, but I think I actually prefer it in the winter. I would advise people, in fact, to come in January and walk along the sandy, white, deserted beach and absorb the tranquility, wander around the art galleries, but bring your own sandwiches. And this level of tourism and holiday homes must be diluting the Welshness of the area as well, as I would imagine. So I thought it was only dutiful to learn a bit of Welsh myself, as I think you should if you come here. So, so far I've just picked up Fa chlamydia wedi pwdrw. Because it's only polite to learn the essential phrases. I can see why you want to protect the place and why it's important to stay the same size. Maybe you should hire bouncers to put a big, thick blue piece of rope around the parish boundary. And any time somebody tries to come in, the bouncers go, "Wait, no, we're full up. No, wait behind the rope. All right, hang on. All right, I've heard 2 people have just left to get chips in Haverfordwest. I'll let 2 in. 2. That's it, 2. So I'll finish with the end of the poem that I read a bit of earlier on, written by a traveller who ended up staying, and that I think sums up the sensual delights and charms of the smallest city. Thank you very much. Here the smallest city, though grand its bells do ring, but I fancy not your chances of a bag of chips till spring. And drowning folk may rest assured we'll keep them all afloat, then stay at sea for years till we've a shed that fits our boat. For St David's noble message echoes firmly from the past. If you want some words of wisdom, I'm afraid I can't be asked. Diolch yn fawr am wrando. If he raglan Mark Steele's in town.
Cafodd Mark Steele's in Town ei ysgrifennu a'i berfformio gan Mark Steele, gyda deunydd ychwanegol gan Pete Sinclair. Y cynhyrchydd oedd Ed Morris.